What do you do when the happiest moment of your life turns into your worst nightmare before you even have time to smile? 3 years ago, I stood inside a hospital room waiting to meet my newborn granddaughters. 20 minutes later, I was planning my son's funeral. But as unbearable as that day was, it wasn't the tragedy that destroyed my family. The real nightmare began 6 weeks later, when my daughter-in-law disappeared without a trace, leaving behind 3 children who had no idea their entire world had just fallen apart. If you've ever wondered how one decision can change generations forever, stay with me. My name is Edward Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and I never imagined I'd become a full-time father again at an age when most people are thinking about retirement. People often tell me I'm strong. They couldn't be more wrong. I wasn't strong. I was simply the only one left. My son, Michael, had always been the kind of man who made everyone around him feel safe. Even as a little boy, he couldn't stand seeing anyone upset. If another child cried at school, Michael would be the first to sit beside them. If someone was struggling to carry groceries, he'd quietly take the bags without waiting to be asked. Some people are born gentle. Michael was one of them. When he grew up, that kindness never disappeared. He became a high school science teacher, not because it paid well, it certainly didn't, but because he loved watching young people discover they were capable of more than they believed. Every Sunday evening, he'd call me after grading papers. "Dad," he'd laugh, "one of my students almost blew up the chemistry lab today." I'd laugh with him. What happened? He actually followed the instructions, just in the wrong order. Those conversations became part of my weekly routine. Back then, neither of us realized how precious ordinary conversations really are. When Michael was 26, he married Vanessa. I'll be honest. The first time I met her, I understood immediately why my son had fallen in love. She was beautiful, confident, the kind of woman who walked into a room and somehow became the center of it without even trying. She had an infectious laugh, endless energy, and a smile that could convince almost anyone she genuinely cared about them. For a while, I believed she did. A year after they married, they welcomed their first daughter, Sophie. The day Michael held Sophie for the first time, he cried harder than the baby did. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered to me, smiling through tears. "You don't have to," I told him. "You already love her. And that's enough. It's everything." He never forgot those words. Because from that day forward, Michael loved being a father with every part of himself. Watching him raise Sophie reminded me of the father I had always hoped to become. He packed her school lunches before work. He braided her hair after watching online tutorials because Vanessa admitted she never learned how. He attended every school performance, every soccer practice, every birthday party, even when he was exhausted. Sometimes I'd stop by their house unexpectedly. I'd find Michael cooking dinner with Sophie, standing on a chair beside him, wearing a tiny apron almost bigger than she was. Vanessa would usually still be at work. Michael never complained. Not once. Whenever I offered to help, he'd simply smile. "I've got it, Dad." And somehow, he always did. But if I'm being completely honest, there were moments that quietly unsettled me. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to as proof. Just little things. Vanessa always seemed distracted during family dinners. Her phone rarely left her hand. It buzzed constantly. She'd excuse herself halfway through meals to answer calls outside. Sometimes she'd come back smiling at messages she never explained. I asked Michael about it once while we were washing dishes after dinner. "Everything all right between you two?" He looked confused. "Of course. She seems busy." He chuckled. "Event planning is crazy this time of year." I nodded. That answer should have satisfied me. Instead, something about it stayed with me. Not because I distrusted Vanessa, because I knew my son. Michael trusted people so completely that betrayal never crossed his mind. He loved without keeping a piece of himself in reserve. And people like that sometimes don't notice they're the only ones giving everything. Years passed peacefully. Sophie grew into a bright, curious little girl who asked more questions in a single afternoon than most adults ask in a month. Then one Tuesday evening, my phone rang. I answered expecting another funny story from Michael's classroom. Instead, I heard him crying. For one terrifying second, I thought something terrible had happened. "Dad," his voice shook. "You're going to be a grandfather again." I laughed with relief. "You scared me." "I'm sorry." He laughed too. "But that's not all." There was a long pause. "So, we're having twins." I don't remember standing up. I only remember suddenly pacing around my kitchen with tears running down my face. Twins. 2 girls. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We just laughed. 2 grown men. Laughing like children. The months that followed were filled with excitement. Margaret, my wife, immediately started knitting tiny blankets in different colors because she insisted every baby deserved something handmade. Our guest room slowly transformed into what she jokingly called grandparent headquarters. A crib, extra diapers, baby monitors, bottles, toys. She planned everything months in advance. I know they'll mostly stay with their parents, I teased. They'll visit. She smiled confidently. They'll visit more than you think. I wish she'd been right for different reasons. The pregnancy, however, wasn't easy. Doctors warned Vanessa that carrying twins placed extra strain on her body. By the final 2 months, she was placed on partial bed rest. Michael took over almost everything. Cooking, cleaning, school drop-offs, doctor appointments, late-night grocery runs, teaching all day, coaching soccer on weekends, then coming home to care for his family. I asked him once if he was exhausted. He looked at Sophie sleeping on the couch beside him and smiled. Yeah. A small laugh escaped him. But I'd do it all again tomorrow. That was Michael. Love wasn't something he talked about. It was something he quietly carried every single day. 2 days before the twins were due, he called me. Nothing important. No emergency. Just one of our usual conversations. Dad, I can't wait. For what? Having all 3 of my girls together. He sounded happier than I'd ever heard him. Sophie's already picked names for all their stuffed animals. I laughed. You're in trouble. I know. Then, right before hanging up, he said something he hadn't said in a long time. Love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Neither of us knew. Those would be the last words we'd ever say to each other. 2 days later, my phone rang at 5:43 in the morning. She's in labor. I grabbed my keys without even changing my clothes. As Margaret and I drove toward the hospital, neither of us realized. We were driving toward the day that would divide our lives forever. The drive to the hospital should have been one of the happiest drives of my life. Margaret couldn't stop talking. She held a small gift bag tightly in her lap, checking every few minutes to make sure the tiny outfits she'd bought for the twins were still neatly folded inside. I wonder who they'll look like, she smiled. Michael, I answered immediately. She laughed. You don't even have to think about it. I've waited my whole life to see my son become the father of 3 little girls. For a brief moment, life felt perfect. If someone had told me that less than an hour later I'd be saying goodbye to my only child forever, I would have called them cruel. By the time we reached the maternity ward, the twins had already arrived. 2 healthy baby girls. The nurses smiled as they led us toward the room. You have beautiful granddaughters. My heart nearly burst. I remember opening that hospital door and seeing Michael standing beside Vanessa's bed. One tiny baby rested peacefully in each of his arms. Tears streamed down his face. Not tears of fear. Not sadness. Pure happiness. I did it, Dad, he whispered. His voice cracked. They're here. The first baby yawned. The second squeezed Michael's finger with her tiny hand. He laughed through his tears. Look at that. She's already stronger than me. Margaret gently touched one baby's cheek. They're beautiful. They're perfect, Michael whispered. Then he looked at me. Dad, I finally understand what you meant. What do you mean? When you told me love changes the moment you become a parent. He looked back down at the twins. I didn't think it was possible to love someone this much. Those words still echo in my mind every single day. The room was filled with laughter. Nurses smiled. Doctors congratulated us. Vanessa looked exhausted but relieved. For just a few minutes, our family existed exactly the way we dreamed it would. 3 generations, standing together. No one knew. Those few minutes were all we had left. Michael suddenly became quiet. At first, no one noticed. He stared at one of the babies for several seconds without speaking. I smiled. Everything all right? He nodded slowly. I just feel. He never finished the sentence. His knees buckled. Both nurses reacted instantly, catching the twins before they slipped from his arms. Michael hit the floor. Hard. The room changed in less than a second. One moment, people were laughing. The next, someone shouted for a crash cart. Doctors rushed inside. Machines appeared from nowhere. A nurse gently pushed Margaret and me toward the hallway. "I'm sorry, you have to step outside." I couldn't move. "My son." "Sir, please." The door closed. Through the small window, I watched strangers fight for my son's life. One doctor performed chest compressions. Another shouted medication doses. A nurse counted every second aloud. The monitor screamed. Then, silence. Another shock. More compressions. Someone yelled, "We're losing him." Margaret collapsed into my arms. She kept repeating the same sentence over and over. No, no, no. I wanted to comfort her. Instead, I stood frozen. My mind refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Michael was 31. Healthy. Active. He coached soccer every weekend. He had never spent a single night in a hospital. How could a man survive years of ordinary life, only to collapse while holding the daughters he'd waited so long to meet? Nothing made sense. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Or maybe 2 hours. Time stopped existing. Finally, the doors opened. A doctor removed his gloves slowly. I've learned something about doctors. They don't have to say anything. Sometimes, you know the answer just by the way they walk toward you. "I'm so sorry." That was all I heard. Everything else disappeared. The hallway, the lights, the voices, even my own heartbeat. It all faded into silence. My only son was gone. Later, the doctors explained it as a sudden and extremely rare cardiac event. No warning signs, no previous symptoms, nothing that routine tests would have detected. It was simply one of those tragedies medicine still cannot always prevent. Those words never brought me comfort, because explanations don't change outcomes. They only give grief a medical name. The hardest part wasn't identifying his body. It wasn't signing paperwork. It wasn't even calling family members to tell them Michael was gone. The hardest part was walking back into that hospital room. The twins were sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that the first person who had ever held them would never hold them again. Sophie arrived later that afternoon with a family friend. She ran into the room smiling. "Can I see my sisters?" She climbed onto the hospital bed carefully. She kissed each baby on the forehead. Then she looked around. "Where's Daddy?" No one answered. She frowned. "Grandpa?" I knelt beside her. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. How do you explain forever to a 6-year-old? The funeral passed like a dream I couldn't wake up from. People hugged us. They cried. They told us Michael had been an amazing teacher, an incredible father, a wonderful husband. Every sentence was true. None of them brought him back. After everyone left, I found one of Sophie's drawings lying beside the flowers. It showed 5 stick figures holding hands. Her, the twins, Michael, Vanessa. Above them she'd written, "My forever family." I stared at that drawing for a long time. I didn't know it then, but within a few weeks, that family would be shattered all over again. Because while we were mourning Michael, someone else was already planning to leave, and none of us saw it coming. People often imagine grief as endless crying. The truth is, real grief is strangely quiet. It hides inside ordinary moments. Making coffee for someone who's never coming home. Reaching for your phone before remembering there's no one left to call. Walking past an empty bedroom and expecting to hear a familiar voice. For weeks after Michael's funeral, Margaret and I lived inside that silence. Every morning we'd drive to Vanessa's house before sunrise. The twins still needed bottles every few hours. Sophie still needed someone to braid her hair before school. And Vanessa, well, she looked exactly how a grieving widow should look. At least, that's what we believed. She barely spoke. She rarely smiled. Sometimes she'd sit in the nursery staring out the window for nearly an hour without saying a single word. Whenever Margaret offered to hold one of the babies, Vanessa would quietly nod before disappearing into another room. We assumed she needed space. Looking back, I wonder if she was simply practicing how it would feel to let someone else raise her children. There were warning signs. Small ones. Easy to ignore. Her phone rang constantly. Every single day. She never answered it in front of us. Instead, she'd step outside onto the porch, or lock herself in the bedroom. Whenever she returned, she looked different. Not happier. Just distracted. Like her mind had already left the house, even if her body hadn't. One afternoon, Margaret whispered to me, Do you think she's all right? I looked across the room. Vanessa was staring at her screen while Sophie tried to show her a drawing she'd made. Without even looking up, Vanessa said, "That's nice, sweetheart." Sophie lowered the paper slowly. She didn't say another word. Something about that moment stayed with me. Children notice attention, and they noticed the lack of it even more. Michael's photograph sat on the living room shelf. Fresh flowers surrounded it. Every evening before we left, I'd stop for a moment and look at my son's smiling face. "I've got them," I'd whisper. "I promise." At the time, I thought I was promising to help their mother. I had no idea I'd soon become their only parent. About a month after the funeral, Vanessa began refusing our help. "I'll manage. You two have already done enough." Margaret smiled. "We're family. I know, but I need to learn how to do this on my own." It sounded reasonable, healthy even. We respected her wishes. Looking back, that was probably the first step in her plan. She wasn't pushing us away because she wanted independence. She was creating distance. The changes became harder to ignore. She started dressing differently. Instead of living in comfortable clothes like most exhausted new mothers, she looked carefully put together. Her makeup returned. Her hair was always styled. Sometimes she'd disappear for hours, saying she had errands. When we offered to watch the babies, she accepted almost too quickly. Margaret once joked, "You look nicer than we do." Vanessa forced a smile. "I guess getting dressed makes me feel normal again." None of us questioned it. Maybe we should have. 6 weeks after Michael died. It was a Saturday morning. I remember because Sophie had a school art project she'd been excited to show me. Margaret baked blueberry muffins before we left home. They're Sophie's favorite. The drive felt ordinary, peaceful. Neither of us knew our lives were about to change forever. When we pulled into the driveway, something immediately felt wrong. No lights. No television. No sound. The front door wasn't fully closed. It sat slightly open, moving gently with the breeze. Margaret looked at me. Did she forget to lock it? I don't know. I knocked anyway. No answer. I pushed the door open. "Vanessa?" Silence. Then, small footsteps. Sophie appeared at the end of the hallway. The moment I saw her face, my heart sank. She wasn't crying. She looked confused. The kind of confusion no 6-year-old should ever have. "Grandpa." She ran into my arms. "Mommy said she'd be back." "When?" She shrugged. "Last night." My stomach tightened. "Who was here with you?" "No one." I looked at Margaret. Neither of us spoke. Then, we heard it. A baby's cry, followed by another. Loud, desperate, hungry. Margaret ran toward the nursery. I followed close behind. The twins were still in their cribs. Their tiny faces were bright red from crying. Their diapers were soaked. Several bottles sat untouched on the dresser. One had already spoiled. Margaret immediately picked up one baby. I lifted the other. They clung to us almost instantly, as if they'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to come. I searched the entire house. Bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, garage, closets. Nothing. Half of Vanessa's clothes were gone. Her suitcase was missing. The jewelry box sat empty. Even framed photographs had disappeared from the bedroom. She hadn't gone shopping. She hadn't stepped out for groceries. She had packed. Carefully. Deliberately. She'd planned this. Then I noticed something else. Michael's wedding photo was gone. Sophie tugged gently on my sleeve. "Grandpa." "Yes, sweetheart." Her tiny voice trembled. "Mommy left with her friend." "What friend?" "The man who came here. When? Lots of times." My heart nearly stopped. "What man?" She thought for a second. "I don't know his name." "What did Mommy say?" Sophie looked down at the floor. She said. There was a long pause. She needed to be happy. The room became completely silent. Margaret covered her mouth. I couldn't breathe. That sentence would haunt me for years. We waited. 1 hour. Then 2. Then 6. Night came. Vanessa never returned. And as I tucked 3 frightened little girls into bed that evening, I realized something terrifying. For the first time since Michael died, those children had no parents left in the house. One had been taken by death. The other had simply walked away. I still hoped there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But deep down, a feeling settled into my chest. The worst wasn't over. It had only just begun. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the twins crying every few hours. Not because Sophie kept waking up from nightmares. But because I couldn't stop staring at the front door. Part of me believed. Any minute now, Vanessa would walk back in. She never did. The next morning, I called her. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. Margaret tried. No answer. We called every relative we could think of. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. For nearly 3 days. It was as if she'd disappeared from the face of the earth. Meanwhile, life refused to stop. The twins still needed feeding. Sophie still had school. Bills still arrived. Laundry kept piling up. Grief doesn't pause responsibility. If anything, it makes responsibility heavier. On the third evening, Margaret's phone rang. She looked at the screen. It's Vanessa. She answered immediately. Vanessa, where are you? For several seconds, Margaret didn't speak. She simply listened. Then I watched the color drain from her face. Slowly, she handed me the phone. You need to hear this yourself. I pressed it against my ear. Vanessa? Her voice sounded calm. Too calm. Not the voice of a terrified mother. Not the voice of a woman desperate to return home. Just calm. I knew you'd take care of them. I frowned. What are you talking about? The girls. I knew they'd be safe with you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When are you coming home? A long silence. Then, I'm not. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. What do you mean you're not? I can't do this anymore. Can't do what? This life. I gripped the phone so tightly my hand began shaking. You have 3 daughters. I know. They need their mother. I never wanted this. Those 5 words hit harder than any scream ever could. I never wanted this. I struggled to stay calm. What about Michael? Her breathing grew heavier. I loved him once. Once. But after he died, she stopped. I realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life pretending. Pretending what? That I was happy. Every sentence felt colder than the last. Then she said something I'll never forget. I've met someone. The room went completely silent. Margaret looked at me, confused. I closed my eyes. What did you say? I've met someone. Who? Derek. The name meant nothing to me. Until suddenly, it meant everything. How long have you known him? She hesitated. Long enough for me to know the answer wouldn't be good. A while. A while. Another silence. Before Michael died, I felt my knees weaken. You were seeing another man. While my son was alive. I wasn't planning for this to happen. Answer me. Quietly. Almost like she was discussing tomorrow's weather. She said, yes. Everything I'd ignored. Every late-night phone call. Every mysterious smile. Every excuse. Every moment she'd stepped outside during family dinners. Suddenly, it all made sense. The affair hadn't started after Michael died. It had already begun. And my son, the kindest man I'd ever known, had never suspected a thing. Because he trusted the woman he loved completely. I could barely speak. So that's it. You're leaving your children? They'll be better off with you. They need their mother. They'll adjust. Adjust. She actually used that word. As though abandoning 3 little girls was something they'd simply grow out of. I looked toward the living room. Sophie was sitting on the floor reading a picture book to her baby sisters. Changing her voice for every character. Trying to make them smile. She was only 6 years old. Already acting like the adult in the house. Does Sophie know? I told her I'd be back. She still believes you. Another silence. I think it's easier this way. No. My voice finally broke. The easier way would have been staying. The call ended a few minutes later. Not because we'd reached an understanding. Because there was nothing left to say. I sat in my car for nearly an hour afterward. Hands still gripping the steering wheel. Unable to move. Unable to think. Margaret eventually opened the passenger door. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. She simply sat beside me. For a long time. Neither of us spoke. Then she quietly whispered, "What do we do now?" I looked back at the house. 3 little girls were inside. 1 grieving her father. 2 too young to understand they'd just lost both parents in different ways. There was only one answer. We take them home. That single sentence changed the rest of our lives. At 72, I wasn't planning birthday parties. I wasn't shopping for diapers. I wasn't learning how to install baby gates or warm bottles at 3 in the morning. I thought those years were behind me. Life had other plans. That afternoon, we packed everything the girls needed. Clothes, blankets, favorite toys, baby formula, family photographs. Sophie quietly carried her little backpack to my car. Before closing the front door, she looked back one last time. Grandpa, yes. What if Mommy comes back? I forced a smile I didn't feel. If she does, she'll know exactly where to find you. Sophie nodded. Then she climbed into the back seat beside her sisters. As I drove away, I looked once in the rearview mirror. 3 little girls, sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that they would never live in that house again. And while I believed the hardest part was finally behind us, I was about to discover that loving children is one thing. Fighting to keep them is something else entirely. The first night the girls slept in our house, Margaret and I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Neither of us touched the cups of coffee we'd made. The house was silent, except for the baby monitor. Every few minutes, one of the twins would cry, then the other. Margaret looked at me. We're too old for this. I smiled sadly. I know. She reached across the table and held my hand. But we're all they've got. That was the moment our decision became permanent. Not because a judge said so. Not because of paperwork. Because love had already made the choice before we ever spoke it aloud. The next few months tested us in ways I never imagined. At 72, my back wasn't built for lifting babies all day. Margaret's knees hurt every time she climbed the stairs to the nursery. Sleep became something we remembered, not something we actually had. Every night followed the same pattern. One twin woke, then the other. Just as they settled, Sophie would wake crying from another nightmare. Sometimes she'd run into our bedroom holding Michael's old sweatshirt. Grandpa, I dreamed Daddy came home. I'd pull her close. I'm sorry, sweetheart. She'd whisper the same question every single time. When will it stop hurting? I wished I knew. The legal battle began only a few weeks later. Because Vanessa hadn't officially surrendered her parental rights. Nothing was simple. We couldn't enroll the girls in certain programs. We couldn't make long-term medical decisions without court approval. Everything required signatures, permissions, meetings, more paperwork than I'd ever seen in my life. One afternoon, a social worker visited our home. She looked around politely before opening her notebook. Mr. Bennett, do you believe you're physically capable of raising 3 children at your age? For a second, I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, because life had become unbelievable. My age didn't choose these children. I answered quietly. They chose me. She lowered her pen. For the first time. So instead, I hugged her. Love is the only answer you have. Children grieve differently than adults. Adults cry. Children ask questions. Hundreds of them. One afternoon while I was helping Sophie with homework, she suddenly stopped writing. Grandpa, yes. If Daddy loved us. He did. Then why didn't he stay? I closed my eyes for a moment. Because sometimes our hearts stop working. She nodded slowly. Then came the question I'd been dreading. And Mommy. The room felt impossibly quiet. I chose every word carefully. Your mother made a choice. Didn't she love us? I reached across the table. Telling you she left because of you would be a lie. The truth is, some adults make choices children never deserve. Sophie stared at her notebook, then quietly whispered, I'll never leave Ella and Emma. She was only 6 years old, but in that moment, she sounded exactly like her father. As the twins grew, Sophie naturally became their protector. She insisted on helping feed them. She learned how to warm bottles. She'd sing little songs whenever they cried. One evening, I walked past the nursery and found all 3 girls asleep together, one baby resting against each of Sophie's shoulders. She'd fallen asleep trying to comfort them. I stood there for several minutes, unable to move, proud, and heartbroken at exactly the same time. No child should have to grow up that fast. Months passed. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. The twins laughed together for the very first time. Not little smiles. Real laughter. Loud enough to fill the entire house. Margaret rushed into the room. What happened? I don't know. I laughed. They're laughing. She began crying. Happy tears. The first happy tears I'd seen since Michael died. For the first time in months. Our house sounded alive again. That tiny moment reminded us of something we'd almost forgotten. Joy still existed, even after unbearable loss. Just when it felt like life was beginning to heal, another storm quietly arrived. At first, Margaret insisted she was simply tired. It's nothing. She smiled. We're just getting older. But I noticed things she couldn't hide. She became breathless climbing the stairs. She sat down more often while cooking. Some mornings, she stayed in bed much longer than usual. Finally, I convinced her to see a doctor. Neither of us imagined that another goodbye was already waiting for our family. And this one would leave me completely alone. I kept telling myself, it was only exhaustion. How could it not be? Margaret was 70. She was helping raise 3 little girls. She barely slept more than 3 hours at a time. Of course she looked tired. Of course she became short of breath. That was what I wanted to believe. Because the alternative terrified me. The doctor ordered several tests. Blood work, heart scans, more appointments than either of us could count. For almost 2 weeks, we lived between our home and the hospital, trying to keep life as normal as possible for the girls. Every morning Margaret still packed Sophie's lunch. Every evening she still insisted on reading bedtime stories. I offered to do it. She smiled. I don't know how many more chances I'll get. At the time, I thought she was joking. Now, I wish I'd listened more carefully. A few days later, the doctor called us into his office. He didn't waste time. Mrs. Bennett, your heart is getting weaker. Margaret squeezed my hand. Can it be treated? We'll do everything we can. It wasn't the answer we were hoping for. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. The silence said everything. That evening, the girls were playing in the living room. Ella was chasing Emma around the coffee table. Sophie was pretending to be their teacher. Margaret watched them with tears in her eyes. They're beautiful. I smiled. They are. She leaned her head against my shoulder. Promise me something. Anything. If something happens to me. I interrupted immediately. Don't. Edward. Please. She gently took my hand. Promise me. I couldn't even look at her. Finally, I whispered. I promise. Raise them exactly the way Michael would have wanted. I will. And don't let them grow up believing they weren't loved. Those words became the most important promise I'd ever make. Over the next several months, Margaret tried to hide how much pain she was in. Whenever Sophie asked, Grandma, are you okay? She'd smile. I'm just a little tired. Then she'd wink. But superheroes get tired too. The girls believed her. I pretended to. Deep inside, I knew time was running out. One autumn afternoon, Margaret asked me to help her onto the back porch. It was Michael's favorite place. He and I used to sit there for hours talking about life, watching sunsets, planning fishing trips we'd never take. Margaret looked toward the old oak tree in the backyard. Remember when Michael built Sophie that swing? I smiled. He insisted it could hold an elephant. She laughed softly. It barely held him. For a few minutes, we forgot hospitals existed. We simply remembered happier days. Then she quietly said, I think he's waiting for me. I turned toward her. Don't say that. She squeezed my hand. I'm not afraid anymore. I was terrified. Margaret passed away 18 months after we brought the girls home. The doctors blamed heart failure. Maybe they were right. But part of me has always believed. Grief helped break what illness had started. She lost her son. Then the future she'd dreamed of. Then the peaceful retirement we'd planned together. Yet somehow, she never stopped smiling for those girls. Not once. The funeral felt painfully familiar. The same church. The same front pew. The same unbearable silence after everyone left. Only this time, I stood there alone. Sophie walked over quietly and slipped her tiny hand into mine. Grandpa. Yeah. Grandma said superheroes don't quit. I looked down at her. She was trying so hard not to cry. I know. So, she took a deep breath. We'll help you. I couldn't speak. I simply pulled her into my arms. Sometimes, children become stronger than adults without even realizing it. That first night after the funeral, the house felt empty. Painfully empty. After putting the girls to bed, I wandered into our bedroom. Margaret's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. Her favorite sweater still hung behind the door. Her half-finished knitting project remained exactly where she'd left it. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried harder than I had since Michael died. For the first time in 50 years, there was no one beside me. No voice telling me everything would somehow be okay. Only silence. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps. Sophie stood in the doorway holding a blanket. I had a bad dream. I lifted the blanket. Come here. She climbed beside me without saying a word. A few minutes later, Ella wandered in, rubbing her eyes. Then Emma. Before I realized what was happening, all three girls were asleep beside me, one resting against each shoulder, the smallest one holding my finger. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything I'd lost. Then I looked at the three little girls sleeping peacefully beside me, and I realized something. Life hadn't left me completely alone. It had simply changed the people who needed me. That night, I stopped asking why these tragedies had happened. Instead, I started asking a different question. How could I give these girls the childhood they still deserved, despite everything life had already taken from them? I had no idea. The answer to that question would arrive in the most unexpected way imaginable. For a long time, I believed surviving was enough. As long as the girls were fed, safe, loved, I told myself I was doing my job. But one afternoon, Sophie asked me a question that made me realize surviving wasn't the same as living. She was 9 by then. The twins had just turned 3. They were sitting on the living room floor building a tower out of colorful blocks, while Sophie quietly finished her homework. Without looking up, she asked, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She put her pencil down. "Do you think Daddy would be proud of me?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What makes you ask that?" She looked toward her little sisters. "I try to take care of them the way he would have." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Because she was right. She did. She reminded them to say please and thank you. She helped them brush their teeth. She read bedtime stories when I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. Sometimes, I forgot she was still just a little girl herself. I walked over and knelt beside her. "Sophie, your father would have been proud of you before you ever did any of those things." She frowned. "Really? He would have been proud simply because you were his daughter." Tears filled her eyes. She threw her arms around me. "I miss him." "I know. So do I." Life slowly found a rhythm again. Not the life we'd planned, but a life we learned to love anyway. Every Saturday morning became pancake day. Ella insisted her pancakes had to be shaped like stars. Emma wanted dinosaurs, even though she'd never actually seen one. Sophie always laughed at both of them. "Grandpa's not a magician." "I know," Emma would answer, "but he tries." Those little moments began healing parts of my heart I thought were gone forever. Every evening after dinner, we had a tradition. One person would share their favorite memory of the day. Sometimes the twins said something silly. "I like my ice cream." "I like chasing butterflies." Simple things, beautiful things. When it was Sophie's turn, she almost always mentioned her father. Daddy would have laughed at that. Daddy used to make pancakes better. Daddy would have loved this movie. At first, those memories made me sad. Eventually, I realized something. As long as we kept talking about Michael, the girls would never truly lose him. One rainy afternoon, I decided it was finally time. I carried an old wooden box down from the attic. Sophie recognized it immediately. "Daddy's things." I nodded. Inside were dozens of photographs. His favorite baseball cap, old birthday cards, a tiny pair of baby shoes I'd saved from when he was born, and a stack of letters. Sophie looked confused. "What are those?" "They're letters your dad wrote. When he was younger." She carefully unfolded one. The handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. Michael had always written exactly the way he spoke. Kindly. Honestly. One letter ended with a sentence I'll never forget. "If I ever become a father, I hope my children always know they're the best thing that ever happened to me." Sophie quietly wiped away a tear. "Daddy really wrote this?" "He did." She smiled through her tears. "I'm going to keep it forever." The twins couldn't read yet, so every night, I'd tell them stories instead. Stories about their father. How he once rescued a tiny bird that had fallen from its nest. How he'd spent an entire afternoon helping Sophie build a blanket fort. How he sang terribly in the car, but never cared who was listening. Ella giggled. "So Daddy was funny?" "The funniest person I ever knew." Emma smiled. "Was he nice?" "The nicest." "Did he love us?" That question never got easier. I gently kissed the top of her head. "More than you could ever imagine." Then, almost 3 years after Vanessa disappeared, a letter arrived. No return address. No name on the envelope. Just mine. For several minutes, I stared at it without opening it. Something inside me already knew. I carefully unfolded the paper. Only a few sentences were written. I'm ready to see the girls. I know they probably hate me, but I'd like another chance. No apology. No explanation. Just another chance. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it again. That night, I didn't sleep at all, because for the first time in years, the woman who had abandoned those children wanted to come back into their lives. And I had no idea whether opening that door again would heal their hearts or break them all over again. A few months after Vanessa's letter, life slowly returned to normal, or at least, as normal as life could be after everything we'd survived. One Saturday afternoon, I decided it was finally time to clean the attic. Margaret had always asked me to organize the old boxes. I kept putting it off. Some memories are easier to leave covered in dust. Hours passed. Old Christmas decorations, Michael's childhood baseball glove, photo albums, school trophies. Then, I found a small cardboard box with Michael's handwriting across the front. Family memories. My hands froze. Inside were dozens of old photographs, birthday cards, a tiny hospital bracelet from the day Sophie was born, and an old smartphone. The battery was dead. I almost tossed it aside. Then I remembered. Michael never deleted anything. He recorded everything. Birthdays, vacations, random family dinners. I suddenly wondered, could there still be something on it? The next morning, I bought a charging cable. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, the screen lit up. I smiled without realizing it. Michael's lock screen appeared. A picture of Sophie sitting on his shoulders at the zoo. It felt like seeing my son again. I slowly opened the gallery. Hundreds of photos. Hundreds of videos. I laughed, then cried, watching clips of ordinary moments I'd almost forgotten. Sophie learning to ride her bicycle. Michael dancing terribly in the kitchen. Vanessa laughing beside him. Before everything fell apart. Then, one file caught my attention. It wasn't labeled with a date. Only one word. If. I pressed play. The screen was dark for a second. Then, Michael appeared. He was sitting in the nursery. The twins' cribs had already been assembled behind him. Vanessa was still pregnant. He looked directly into the camera and smiled. Well, I know this probably looks a little strange. He laughed softly. I've been reading stories online about dads recording messages for their kids, just in case life doesn't go according to plan. I know. Pretty dramatic. But your grandfather always says it's better to prepare for something you'll never need than need something you never prepared. He looked down for a moment, then back into the camera. If you're watching this, it probably means my girls are old enough to understand what I'm about to say. My heart stopped. Michael smiled. Sophie, if you're watching, you're probably pretending you're not crying. He laughed. You've always tried to be brave. I hope you're still asking too many questions. I hope you're still making everyone around you smile. Then he looked toward the empty crib behind him. And to my 2 little girls. I haven't met you yet, but I already love you more than you'll ever understand. His eyes filled with tears. I don't know what you'll grow up to become. I don't know what your favorite colors will be. I don't know which one of you will inherit Grandpa's stubbornness. He laughed. Although I'm guessing both of you. Then his smile softened. But I know one thing. You will never spend a single day wondering whether your father loved you. Because I already do. More than words can explain. He became unusually quiet, almost as if he were searching for the perfect sentence. If life is kind, I'll spend decades embarrassing you. I'll scare away your first boyfriends. I'll teach you how to ride bikes. I'll cry at your graduations. And one day, I'll probably become the annoying grandpa who gives your kids too much candy. He smiled. But, if life has other plans, I need you to remember something. His voice cracked. This world will sometimes take people away before you're ready. But love doesn't disappear. It simply changes the way it reaches you. He looked directly into the camera, as if he somehow knew. One day, his daughters would be watching. If Grandpa is sitting beside you right now. Michael smiled. Take care of him. He's going to pretend he's stronger than he really is. He'll tell terrible jokes. He'll worry too much. And he'll probably spoil all 3 of you. I couldn't stop crying. It felt like my son was speaking directly to me across time. Then Michael whispered the words that broke me completely. Dad, if you're watching this, thank you for teaching me how to be a father. If I ever become even half the man you are, I'll consider my life a success. I covered my face with both hands, because my son never got the chance. That evening, I gathered the girls in the living room. I found something today. Sophie looked curious. What is it? A message. From your dad. The room became completely silent. I pressed play. For the next 15 minutes, no one spoke. The twins watched every second without blinking, even though they had no memories of him. Somehow, they already loved him. When the video ended, Ella quietly whispered, "That was Daddy." I nodded. Emma climbed into my lap. "He loves us." "Yes. He always will." Sophie couldn't stop crying. She hugged the phone against her chest as though she never wanted to let it go. For the first time in years, she wasn't grieving the father she'd lost. She was finally meeting the father she'd never truly had the chance to know. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, I walked onto the back porch. The same porch where Michael and I had spent countless evenings talking about life. I looked up at the stars and smiled through my tears. "You kept your promise, son. They know. They know exactly how much you love them." A gentle breeze moved through the old oak tree. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, because death had taken my son's future. It had taken his dreams. It had taken every tomorrow he should have lived. But it never took the most important thing he left behind: his love, his daughters, and now, his voice. My name is Edward Bennett. I lost my son on the happiest day of his life. But years later, he still found a way to raise his daughters. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive when we pray for them. Sometimes, they're simply waiting inside an old box in the attic, until the day our hearts are finally ready to open them.